The NFC West is seemingly up for grabs. With the 49ers winning the division last year, the LA Rams and the Seattle Seahawks are now looking to try to win the division. But is there going to be a new leader in this division? Well, today, let's talk about the NFC West and do my official NFC West division preview. Hi guys, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the NFC West today, a really fun division with 4 very fun teams. Now, obviously, only a couple of these teams are actually playoff contenders. We'll talk about that once we get to each individual team. So with that being said, we're going to be talking about each individual team for about 2 to 3 minutes each. And then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my official overall view of the division. Now, real quick before I get into the video, about 93% of you guys who watch my content aren't subscribed. So if you guys enjoy the content, please hit the like and subscribe button. But let's hop into the video. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off by talking about each individual team, and we are going to begin with the Seattle Seahawks. Now, last year, the Seattle Seahawks went 9-8 and had a net point differential of -38. And in this offseason, they basically overhauled the entire coaching staff and brought in a couple of key new players to add to the defense. They brought in Mike Macdonald, the defensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens, which I thought was an excellent hire for a new head coach. I think that he was one of those guys who was destined to be a head coach in the NFL at some point, and I think that giving him an opportunity in Seattle with what is an already really good roster should do a lot of wonders for his career. As it goes for the general roster, let's start off with the offense. Starting at quarterback is going to be Geno Smith, but I am very intrigued to see if Sam Howell potentially does get some playing time this year. I'll go on a bit of a record here and say that Sam Howell is an underrated quarterback, and last year he wasn't given the best opportunity, but I think this year, if he was to somehow get into a game, then I do think he would succeed at a fairly high level. The weapons for Geno Smith or Sam Howell are going to be Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Based off of every sort of media outlet that I've heard from, Jackson Smith-Njigba's role probably is going to be increased this upcoming season. I've heard some people say that he potentially could be the wide receiver 1 for this team, which I think is a bit far-fetched, but I will be interested to see if he actually could step into like a receiver 2 like role next to DK Metcalf. I think that is extremely likely to happen, and I think it would be a really good thing for this offense. The offensive line is still pretty solid. It's not the greatest offensive line, but if you can get Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas to play like they usually do, then I do think this offense could be really good next year. Are they going to be a top 10 offensive line? Probably not, but I think as long as they're around a top 15 to top 20-ish unit, this team is good enough to at least be like a top 10 offense. Then you have the defense, which I do expect to take a drastic step forward this upcoming season. Last year, they were a weird defense with so much talented players, but they were underperforming like crazy. And now they're heading into a situation with a head coach who seemingly should be able to get everything out of these guys. Assuming that Mike McDaniel can do that, I actually think this defense has a lot of really good talented players, and I think you'll see a bunch of really good performances from guys like Tariq Woolen, Devon Witherspoon, Julian Love, Uchenna Nwosu, Tyrell Dodson, who I'm extremely excited to see him play in Seattle, and then of course everybody along the defensive line. So I think all in all, this is a really solid roster. I just don't know quite yet what the upside of this team is, because it's really hard to guess how good Mike McDaniel will be in his rookie year. So I think worst case scenario for the Seahawks team, you end up 3rd in the division, probably with like 9 or 10 wins, kind of like last year. But I do think there's a really good possibility for this team to somehow potentially win the division and win like 12 or 13 games. I think just simply looking on paper at this roster, you're looking at a roster that's really, really awesome. And while it does have a couple of holes here and there, and it's not like the perfect roster, nor is it the best roster in the NFL, I still think there's a lot of really good players on this team to at least make this team a legitimate playoff contender. So as it goes for trying to predict how many games they're going to win this year, because I think there's so much different variety as to how this team can perform next year, I'm going to guess they're going to win somewhere between like 9 to 12 wins next year. Obviously, I think the 9 would be like their floor, with 12 being somewhat of their ceiling. I think as long as Geno Smith is the quarterback, I don't really know if I'll ever predict this team to make a deep playoff run, but I also think Geno Smith is a really solid quarterback, so it's kind of difficult to say. But we shall see what happens this year. I'm excited to see this team, and I'm excited to see Sam Howell in a Seahawks uniform. But next up, let's go ahead and talk about the division winners last year, the San Francisco 49ers, the team that made it all the way to the Super Bowl but fell up just a tad bit short. Last year, we all know the story. They went 12-5, had a net point differential of positive 193, which is absolutely ridiculous. And they would make it to the Super Bowl before they fell just a tad bit short of the Kansas City Chiefs. And in this offseason, they essentially brought back the exact same roster, plus a couple players like Devondre Campbell and Leonard Floyd. And I think for the most part, you can kind of expect the exact same thing from the San Francisco 49ers this upcoming season. I think just like last year, they're going to have long stretches of the season where they look like the genuinely best team in the league. And then there could be other parts of the season where they maybe look like a really good team, but a team that may be underperforming. I do think this upcoming season does depend greatly on whether or not they can keep Brandon Ayuk on this roster. Seemingly every single week there is new news on Brandon Ayuk of whether or not he's going to be staying or if he's requested a trade, or just crazy rumors that honestly shouldn't be happening because he should be getting paid by now. Assuming Brandon Ayuk does stay, I think this team will be just as good as they were last year. But I think the real fun conversation does happen when Brandon Ayuk does potentially get traded. If these trade requests are legitimate and if he actually does get traded this offseason, which again, I'll reiterate, I don't think it's going to happen, but if it were to happen, then I do think that would spice things up a lot more in this division. Because as I sit here today, I do think San Francisco is the clear favorite to win the division despite the really good teams in this division. But if you move off of a guy like Brandon Ayuk, who is a big part of this offense that kind of helps the engine run, I definitely do think that maybe takes this team back a little bit. Because you look at like the Rams, who we'll talk about here in a second, but they're a really good roster. And then you look at Seattle, who we have already talked about, and they've already kind of shown that they can put up a fight against some of these really good teams. And all of a sudden, the San Francisco 49ers may be losing their spot in this division. But again, because I don't think it's going to happen, I think that it's more than likely going to be the case that the San Francisco 49ers are going to be really awesome next year and probably the winners of this division, and who knows, maybe they'll win the NFC yet again. So with that being said, in terms of how many wins I think they will get, I will probably assume that they're going to win somewhere between like 11 to 13. Last year they won 12, and I think this year they'll be, again, kind of similar to what they already were. But let's go ahead and move on now to the Arizona Cardinals, probably the team that I am most excited to watch within this division, maybe outside of the Rams. And I'm honestly excited to see the Seahawks. This is honestly a really fun division, but regardless, the Arizona Cardinals last year were somewhat disappointing, but it's also kind of hard to say you're disappointing when you have a rookie head coach, a really poor roster, and no starting quarterback for 90% of the season. But regardless, the team did go 4-13 and had a net point differential of negative 125. And I think last year, despite the poor record, I was still kind of impressed with how they performed in a lot of their games. They won a lot of games they probably shouldn't have won, but they also lost a couple of games that they were really close to winning. And for a team that is as poorly constructed as they were last year, I kind of thought that was pretty impressive. I look at this roster now and I actually kind of like where they're at, especially for their long-term future. At quarterback, you obviously have Kyler Murray, who is kind of a weird discussion point for quarterbacks, because there's people out there who say that Kyler Murray is a top 10 quarterback, which I don't really disagree with, but I also don't agree with. And then there's also people who say he's just a top 20 quarterback, which I think is about where I would say right now. But that isn't because he sucks or hasn't played well when he's out on the field. It's just that it feels like we haven't seen him play in a long time just after the injuries. So if we do get a fully healthy Kyler Murray season, I do think he's going to prove to the world that he's an awesome quarterback, and I think that will be the case. Because I think the team around him, offensively speaking, is actually quite nice. You have a running back tandem of guys like James Conner and Trey Benson, with James Conner being more of your bruisier, hard-nosed, put his nose in your face type of guy, whereas Trey Benson's a bit more of a speedster who's also not afraid to get physical. And then in your receiving core, you brought in some upgrades with Marvin Harrison Jr., who's going to be playing alongside Michael Wilson and Zay Jones. Not to mention Greg Dortch will also be on this team as well. Last year, you could have made the case that Michael Wilson was kind of their technical wide receiver 1 last year, when that should never be the case. He's really good as a wide receiver 3 option, and that's what he's going to be this year. I'm excited to see what Marvin Harrison Jr. can be on this team. Obviously, we all know how good of a prospect that he is, but I'm very intrigued to see what he's going to look like on a team that isn't fully loaded like Ohio State was. I still think regardless of what team he's on, he's going to be an awesome player, and I think he should easily probably get around 1,000 yards in his rookie year. Then you have Trey McBride, who is finally starting to get some recognition. I thought he was one of the best tight ends last year, and it looks like he's finally getting that respect to be one of the best tight ends in the league, at least in consideration. The offensive line brought in some new upgrades, but I still think it's a work in progress. Paris Johnson Jr. is now entering year 2, and I am excited to see what he can do this year after a full offseason, after a full season last year. Hopefully he could take a small step forward. Then you brought in Jonah Williams to play that right tackle position. I don't really love the contract, but at the same time, you got to protect Kyler Murray, so I do understand it. Defensively speaking, it's a pretty interesting unit. Zaven Collins will be as that edge rusher next to BJ Ojulari. And I am quite excited to see what these defensive tackles do. There really isn't a big name player here. Like, you got Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones and Roy Lopez, but I'm not sure quite yet if any of those guys are necessarily stars. So will very much be an interesting talking point later in the season if these defensive tackles potentially do hold back this defense in some ways. Linebackers wise, you have Mac Willison and Kaiser White and Dennis Gardeck. I think all of these guys are pretty solid. I'm very excited to see Mac Wilson play in Arizona, and I'm very excited to see what this linebacking core can do. I don't think it's necessarily a great linebacking core, but I think there's some potential there. Then your secondary is interesting. Again, I think there's a lot of interesting points on this team. You have Sean Murphy-Bunting, who is a good player. Jalen Thompson is a solid safety. Buda Baker, we obviously know a lot about. Then you got Max Melton as your right outside cornerback, and Garrett Williams, who would likely be playing your nickel / slot corner. I think this is a pretty solid secondary, but again, I don't think it's necessarily filled with any major stars outside of maybe Buda Baker. So all in all, this is a really solid Cardinals team that I do expect to take a big step forward after being pretty bad last year. You're finally going to be healthy with all your players starting, and assuming that you stay healthy the entire season, then I do expect this team to be somewhat decent next year. I still think this roster is a few years away from being serious contenders in the NFC, but I think as of now, this could definitely be a nice stepping stone here for this Cardinals team. Last year, you were a really bad team. You got a really good pick. You drafted a really good player, and now this year you should be a slightly better team, but still not a great team. Last year you won 4 games, so this upcoming season I think it's pretty realistic to say that they'll win somewhere between 6 to 9 games next year. My thought process for the Cardinals is that you were pretty bad last year, and now you get a bunch of really good players, and you should be pretty decent this year. I think it's pretty simple, basic improvements for this team. But with that being said, let's go ahead and head into the last team in this division, the LA Rams, the team that I'm probably the most excited for. Even though I said that exact same quote about the Arizona Cardinals, I'm actually probably the more excited about the LA Rams. Last year, the LA Rams went 10-7 and had a net point differential of 27. And in this season, you basically brought back the exact same team, plus a couple of additions. And you're really banking on continuity for this team being kind of the big improvement point for this, especially offense. Because offensively speaking, it is essentially the exact same roster as last year, plus like Jimmy Garoppolo, Blake Corum, and a couple offensive linemen like Jonah Jackson. But weapons-wise, you still have Matthew Stafford, you still have Kyron Williams, you still have Cooper Kupp, Tutu Atwell, Puka Nacua. You do bring in some guys like Blake Corum and Jordan Whittington, who in college were productive players. At least Blake Corum was extremely productive, and Jordan Whittington is kind of that mold of what you would want in a LA Rams uniform, so I'm extremely excited to see if maybe he gets some playing time this year. But when it comes down to it, you have a really good receiving tandem of Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, and Matthew Stafford just knows how to get the ball to them. I think for me, the fun part about this team is what this defense can potentially become. I thought their draft picks of Braden Fisk and Jared Verse were extremely awesome picks. You already had some young studs on this defense with guys like Kobe Turner, not to mention Byron Young can also get to the quarterback as well, so I thought defensive line-wise, it was pretty solid. But then, of course, after the retirement of Aaron Donald, you had to find some new replacements, so getting a guy like Braden Fisk and Jared Verse I thought were awesome pickups. And I think this defense, honestly, should be pretty solid last year. You get a new cornerback one with Tre'Davious White. Hopefully he can stay healthy alongside guys like Darius Williams and Kobe Durant. If this defense can stay fully healthy, like they kind of have not been able to do as of late, but if they can stay healthy, I think this team should be pretty awesome next year. I don't really know what the ceiling is for this team quite yet, but I definitely do think the floor has definitely been raised. As of today, if I had to guess if they're going to win the division, I would probably say no, but if there was a team that was going to win the division that was not named San Francisco, then I would probably say the LA Rams because they have a pretty solid roster all around. Not to mention I trust Sean McVay, he might be the best head coach in this division. I don't really feel like I have to talk about this team in much detail because we all know the LA Rams, they won the championship a few years ago. We all expect them to be back in contention mode this season. I would say this is the best roster this Rams team has had since that championship, so it'll be interesting to see if they can maybe get back to that point. So in terms of how many games they'll win, I will probably put them in the same boat with the San Francisco 49ers here. I'll have them winning somewhere between 11 to 13 games next year. I think the roster is very solid, and assuming that players like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk play pretty good in their rookie season, I think this team has a really high ceiling. So alright, we talked about each individual team for a couple minutes, but now let's actually just do a quick big overview of the NFC West. Like I said throughout the video, this is a really fun division that is going to be really entertaining to watch in this upcoming season. It's kind of a three-headed race for the winner of the division, with of course San Francisco being the favorite, and then you have the LA Rams and the Seattle Seahawks, who are both fighting with San Francisco to potentially win the division. division. Arizona is kind of on the outside looking in, but I still feel as if they're a pretty solid team, and if the Cardinals are the worst team in your division, that's how you know your division is pretty dang good. So as we sit here today, I don't really think the division will change too much in terms of the order of the division. I think the Niners will be number one, then I think the Rams, then I think the Seahawks, and then I think the Cardinals. I think the big difference from last year to this year is going to be how many wins each team does get, because I could realistically see a world where Arizona gets like 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 wins next year. Then you have the Seahawks, who maybe have 9, 10, 11, maybe even 12 wins next year. Then you have the LA Rams, who I think will be kind of similar to San Francisco, where either one of those teams could win 11, 12, 13, or 14 games. So as I sit here today, I predict that, but I definitely do think by the end of the year, I wouldn't be shocked at all if LA were to jump a team like San Francisco, or maybe even Seattle were to jump a team like the LA Rams, for all I know. And also, last little point I'll make before we get out of here, keep an eye on the Arizona Cardinals. They're a really solid team, and assuming that Kyler Murray plays like the regular Kyler Murray, that is a team that could actually be low-key pretty solid next year. It seems like every year we have at least like one team that we expect to be really bad that ends up being actually pretty decent, and I think that Arizona could potentially be that team. Now, does that mean that they'll finish anywhere higher than 4th in this division? Probably not, because the rest of the division is pretty stacked, but hypothetically speaking, if Seattle were to somehow underperform, maybe a team like Arizona could potentially jump them. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we look forward to this upcoming season. But as I mentioned earlier, if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, because that would mean a lot to me. But I love you guys. Peace.